Folks, we live in the most prosperous, the freest, the most dynamic society in human history. And it's been this way for over 200 years. We live in truly a remarkable culture. And yet for all that, there is a list of different pathologies in our society that are quite disturbing. And near the top of that list is the disparity between Black Americans and white Americans. It's one of the most troubling aspects of our society. Blacks are overrepresented in most of the bad stuff in our society, and they are underrepresented in much of the good stuff. And why is that? Well, before we dive into our attempt to answer that, let's take a moment to pray. Join me. Oh God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So what accounts for these disparities? Well, progressive elites in the last 150 years have tried to answer that question with sweeping all-purpose answers. And we saw back in March how the pendulum has swung from one all-purpose answer to another. In the late 1800s to the 1940s, the answer was biology. The difference between blacks and whites was due to inherent racial characteristics between black and white. Darwin's theory of evolution provided the scientific explanation that some racial groups are more evolved than others. So the dominance of whites reflects a more advanced evolution over black and brown people. Progressives believed that the survival of the fittest doctrine in Darwin made the more advanced races, gave them the responsibility to purify the gene pool, the human gene pool, through segregation, through sterilization, through birth control and abortion. These are the tools of social engineering that dominated the early part of the 20th century. And Nazis, it's called eugenics. And Nazis gave that form of progressivism, they took it to its logical extreme, which we saw at the end of World War II. And this ruined the credibility of the science of eugenics for progressives in Western democracies. So then the pendulum swung from biology as the sweeping all-purpose answer to sociology. Progressives chalked up racial disparities to environmental factors like poverty and prejudice against underserved communities. All right, so now the basic idea here is that people are born good, that we learn to be bad. We are corrupted by the institutions of society. So social pathologies like crime and poverty result from the social structures that much more than from individual behaviors and decisions. So in this mindset, this progressive mindset, the finger of blame points outward at society for social pathology rather than inwardly at individual choices. The society is responsible, not the individual. So progressives want the state in this system to nurture citizens like a parent nurtures the children. in every aspect of their lives, controlling their influences and environment, their activities, their thinking, to raise up a people for the state that are, well, they are ordered for liberty and for responsibility. And this is called paternalism, or colloquially known as the nanny state. And the Great Society legislation sponsored by President Johnson in the War on Poverty in the mid and late 1960s gave progressives the tools of social engineering to create the conditions in this society that they thought were necessary for blacks to thrive. Their solution was vast infusions of federal money and activity of federal agencies, providing public transportation, government jobs, government-imposed hiring quotas, government schools, government housing, government health care, and vastly expanded welfare entitlements to most black communities in America. And how did it work? Well, we now have the benefit of 50 years of data, and it's clear that the Great Society failed for a very significant portion of black Americans. And here's one way to illustrate that, okay? The national poverty rate among blacks fell from 87% of blacks in 1940 fell under the poverty line. 87%. That's stunning, isn't it, in 1940. By 1960, that number had fallen from 87% down to 47% of blacks lived under the poverty line. Entirely on their own, blacks were moving out of poverty under Jim Crow, before the Civil Rights and Great Society legislation. But when those programs came into existence in the mid and late 1960s, the decline in poverty slowed dramatically, okay? From 1960 to the present, it's only gone down 4% since then. So in the 20 years before the Great Society, it went down 40 percentage points. In the 50 years since the Great Society, it's only gone down 4 percentage points. These progressive programs actually slowed black self-improvement. These progressive programs clearly enabled some blacks to gain greater wealth and influence in American society since the Great Society, but it also dramatically increased the disparities between blacks who rise to middle and upper classes of American society and the majority of blacks who remain trapped in government housing projects. The soft bigotry of low expectations that are embedded in the Great Society government paternalism has helped to create a permanent black underclass by providing validation and incentives that reinforce unhealthy attitudes and behaviors toward family and work and education and crime and community. These programs have created a mindset of dependency on the government. They've displaced men from many families and communities, and they've stolen people's responsibility for their own rise in self-improvement. These programs and the attitudes and the cultural mindset that they have fostered have become internal barriers to black thriving that inhibit their ability to rise and flourish in cities in America. Now, the numbers show that these internal barriers are a more serious impediment to black flourishing than the external barriers under progressive segregation policies of Jim Crow era. Though the progressive approach has been to swing between extremes of biology and sociology, in March, I hinted that there's a third way to understand the disparities between black and white in America. And that third way is culture, okay? And I think this explanation, culture, explains a lot. I think it fits the complex reality a lot better than these sweeping theories of biology and sociology. And you might remember back to March, our little discussion of the disparities between Swedish music and black music in America, right? Between the Swedish polka and black blues, jazz, rock, Motown, funk, hip hop. What explains the disparities in the relative popularity of these musical styles? We saw in March how ridiculous it is to chalk up those disparities to either biology on the one hand, you know, like there's just something about Swedish genes that make it impossible for them to like keep a beat, I don't know, or the sociology, this external sociological explanation, like there's some inherent anti-Swedish bias built into American society, all right? But I think that those don't explain the difference very well, but I think culture explains a lot, all right? So that traditional style of Nordic music produced the polka, you know, with the tuba and the accordion. And the style does not have wide appeal outside of Northern European communities, typically up in the upper Midwest. Most people just don't groove to a tuba, right? But African American culture has produced a musical tradition that is soulful. It is highly dynamic. It is sad and yet hopeful, with an edge of protest, a very contagious beat, and immensely powerful vocals. One of the most astonishing things about black music is how dynamic it is, how adaptive, how fluid. Something about black culture that makes that possible. Whereas in northern, upper Midwest, Nordic culture, they're happy keeping the polka just as it always has been. These are cultural differences. All of that, all those attributes of black music in America come from African American culture, from their experience here for 400 years. That style has immense appeal and influence, and the dynamism of it make it adaptive to each different generation of Americans. I mean, it has changed the world. In the same way, there are cultural differences between black and white communities in America, between different kinds of white communities in America, between all the different immigrant communities in American society. And culture is this mysterious and complex mixture of internal factors and external forces through history that help some groups to thrive in the context in which they live, while keeping other groups from thriving in the same setting. And there's just no all-purpose explanation and solution to these differences because it's complex. So let's get into that. Let's dig a little deeper. And before we do that, we need to take a moment to talk about a classical biblical approach to questions of culture, okay? of human experience and society. And let's contrast that with a progressive approach from the last 150 years. All right, so progressives have shown themselves to be enamored of sweeping theoretical and ideological frameworks, which they typically seek to impose vigorously upon the complex reality of life and society. And they do it time and again through propaganda, through coerced uniformity of thought. From the French Revolution to today's woke university context, progressives have shown themselves to be ideological and bent on propaganda and coerced uniformity of thought. And wherever they have the power to do so, it results in disastrous consequences. Just look at various attempts at imposing socialism on society in the 20th century. Now, in contrast to that, classical biblical thought gives us tools for thought and action that empower individuals, groups, and societies to thrive. All right, so here's the outline of classical biblical thought. It's informed by wisdom, which seeks to grasp the nature of reality as it is and to live harmoniously within it. Because classical biblical thought believes in a creator God who made things to be the way they are. And a wise person seeks to discover how things are. We embrace critically the accumulated wisdom of prior generations. In classical biblical thought, those generations go back thousands of years, all right, of received wisdom that we embrace critically as we seek to understand the vast complexity of the world and human experience, all right? We also accept God's revelation in Scripture to teach us things about God, about the world, about ourselves that we could not otherwise know. So a wisdom approach receives revelation. And through a disciplined use of reason and observation, which in the classical biblical approach we believe is reflective of the image of God, we probe the immensely complex realities of the world around us, seeking to understand, probing, questing, discovering, pioneering, seeking to understand. And all of this is done, ideally, all right, in a setting of respectful and reasoned dialogue and open inquiry. The biblical approach says to the complex question of black and white disparities in America, well, there are both internal and external factors at work here. It's not one or the other, it's both. So instead of developing grand social theories that seek to account for everything and that further empower people at the top to make sweeping changes in society, let's work with concrete cases, individual cases, and find out what works best in each situation. Let's empower local people who are involved in that case to make the decisions, to have a hand in their own future. Because for them, these problems are not abstract, and they have to live with the results of whatever solutions get adopted. It's not like bureaucrats living in large cities making decisions that affect millions of people, and then they get to go home to the suburbs in the evening and pour themselves a drink. No, these people have to live with the solutions that get implemented, All right? So allow them the maximum latitude to find and implement those solutions collaboratively rather than remote, centralized experts who get to go home to the suburbs at the end of the day. All right, so this approach recognizes that people are responsible, that people can choose to improve their lives and their communities. It acknowledges that social change is typically slow, that it happens one person at a time through persuasion. It seeks to empower each person to become their best selves, to make the best decisions that they can in the context in which they live. It recognizes that these changes are incremental and hopefully cumulative, because revolutionary changes, like bulldozing tenement neighborhoods and moving masses of people into high-rise government housing, or defunding the police and imposing bail reform, like up in New York City, which allows people charged in violent crimes to go free at the end of the day, because these sweeping revolutionary changes, well, they create more problems than they solve. They may be well-intended, but the law of unintended consequences reigns at the end of the day, right? So a classical biblical approach helps create both the internal and the external conditions for people to rise and thrive above the disparities that divide our society. And I think the best thing about this classical biblical approach is that there's a centuries-long track record of its effectiveness. From the rise and recovery of Europe following the collapse of the Roman Empire back in the 500s, to the rise and dominance of European societies in the last 500 years, to the global elimination of slavery in the last 200 years, and the gradual reform of a multitude of other injustices in the world today. The march of justice has covered so much ground in the last 2,000 years, and it must continue. But it's got to focus on both the internal and the external barriers to thriving. There's no one sweeping answer that explains all the problems. There's no one centrally imposed sweeping solution. And I think that history demonstrates that we've got to start from within, from those internal barriers to thriving, by focusing first on what is it that in our hearts and minds that are holding us back. That's the question that communities that are not thriving need to ask. It starts with learning what successful minority groups have done in the past to rise above their marginalization. What beliefs, decisions, actions, and habits move them in a better direction? And what beliefs, decisions, actions, and habits move them in a worse direction? Notice that we are focused here on internal causes, irrespective of the external forces that are operating on these communities. This is a profoundly empowering stance because we can't control all that. But we can control what we think and what we do and what we teach the next generation. We have control over that, don't we? So let's consider an example. Scotland. That's right, Scotland. From Roman times, the Scots lagged far behind England to the south. And In the 14th century, when William Wallace was Braveheart, and many of you have seen that movie, when William Wallace was Braveheart in the 14th century, it was said that there was no Scottish baron, those Scottish lords, who could write his own name. Scottish literacy did not exist. Scottish agriculture was primitive. Its industry was non-existent. The people were illiterate. There was no law and order other than what local chieftains imposed by force. As mountain people on the outer fringe of society, the Scots were geographically isolated, and for centuries, the English had easily dominated and exploited Scotland militarily and culturally. They often did so through a corrupt Scottish aristocracy that had been bought and paid for. The Scots were painfully aware of their inferiority to the English. So these are some serious internal and external barriers to Scottish thriving, right? And for centuries, they adopted a victim mindset, blaming the brutal depredations of the English, focusing almost exclusively on militarily resisting the English. And they were largely unsuccessful in that resistance. And they remained backward for many decades, generations, centuries. But from Braveheart in the mid-1300s to Rob Roy in the mid-1700s, the movie Rob Roy, mid-1700s, the Scots underwent one of the most dramatic transformations in history. They raised themselves from being the most backward part of Europe, with few natural resources, living in poverty, divided and warlike, long held in place under the English boot. They transformed themselves into one of the most advanced societies within the most advanced empire in the world. And it started, as Thomas Sowell describes it, with a sharp cultural cringe, grappling with the reality of their cultural inferiority, ouch, and moving to adopt and adapt more successful English ways. Now, in our multicultural age, you're just not allowed to talk like this. Because for the last 40, 50 years, every culture is considered of equal value and worthy of celebration, right? I mean, it's an article of faith in our society these days. But in the real world of history, ingrained cultural attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors and habits matter for good or ill, because culture has consequences. And blinding ourselves to those consequences is not a strategy for success for marginalized minorities, whether they are Asians or Jews in America, or Scots in Britain. The Scots didn't ignore the cultural realities, their cultural inferiority. They didn't at all. No, the lowland Scots started learning English and copying English ways. And the Highland Scots, well, they copied the lowlanders. Thomas Sowell, in his book, Black Rednecks, White Liberals, and his other book on disparities and discrimination, shows how Scots put sustained focus on internal factors that they had control over within their own society, within their own thinking. And the most significant factor in Scotland's rise was the spread of Calvinist Protestantism. They became Presbyterians, particularly after the year 1600. Calvinists put enormous emphasis on literacy in Scotland so that every Scot could read the Bible in English. And of course, the Bible then was the King James Bible, James I, published in 1611, who was a Scottish king raised up over all of England, published in 1611. The King James Bible opened to the Scots a whole new world of reading, of English literature for Scottish students. And that Protestant emphasis on education caught on so widely in the lowlands that they created a system of compulsory schooling for young Scottish bairns before England did. And they soon developed the most extensive system of schools in Europe. By the 1800s, Scotland had 4 universities, while England only had 2. And this produced not only an educated class in Scotland, but an intellectual class as well. From the middle of the 1700s to the middle of the 1800s, that century there, most of the leading British intellectual figures were Scots or they were Scottish descended, like James Watt in engineering, Adam Smith in economics, David Hume in philosophy, Joseph Black in chemistry, Sir Walter Scott in literature, John Stuart Mill in economics and philosophy. The names go on and on, folks. Those are just the most well-known. In some fields, Scots came to dominate for centuries, like medicine and engineering. Did you know that the first medical schools in America were founded by Scots? And they set the world standard in engineering as well, particularly shipbuilding, so that by the late 1800s, half the ships in Britain were built in Scotland. All right, so and we're talking about Britain here, right? So the British Empire, a seafaring empire, half those ships were built in Scotland. So within 2 centuries, the Scots were able to surpass those whom they emulated, the English. They surpassed the English. That's astonishing, isn't it? And they did it against, well, you know what they did it against. External difficulties. Now, many minorities have done the same in America. Asians, for example, have higher educational and economic outcomes, household incomes, than whites do. Jews do as well. And you probably didn't know this, but one of the most highly placed immigrant groups in the United States today are Nigerian immigrants. Nigerian immigrants have succeeded wildly in America. And African Americans, the descendants of slaves, have too. They have thrived in stunning ways in the wake of the Great Society. And we don't have time today, of course, to review a full who's who of African Americans who have risen to power and fame and wealth and influence in politics, military, academia, entertainment, law, politics, and sports. But as we're often reminded, far too many African Americans haven't risen. Far too many have ended up trapped in a permanent underclass, generation after generation. I've made the case that the barriers that hold them there are, in many cases, internal barriers, counterproductive patterns of belief, behavior, and habit with regard to marriage and child rearing, work and education, crime and community life, But there are many external barriers that keep people in ghettos as well. And what are those external barriers? Well, in actual cases, case after case, progressive social welfare policies reinforce perverse incentives, particularly with regard to marriage and child rearing and work. A grievance industry that nurtures a sense of powerlessness and defiance toward wider American culture. Corrupt urban bureaucracies in city after city that somehow manage to combine some of the highest spending per student on education with some of the lowest educational outcomes in the nation. How do you do that? And the performance of these failed school systems contrasts sharply with parochial schools in the same cities, which spend far less per student, but achieve outcomes that are on par with other groups in American society. These external barriers to Black thriving are not whites in general, are not America as a whole. It's hard to see how you can chalk it up to white supremacy, because these systems, these urban systems, are run by specific policies, specific politicians in specific jurisdictions where most of the pathologies afflicting Black and Hispanic communities consistently cluster in American society. You can't just blame it on the general when these things cluster in cities where the same policies, the same political party has dominated for many generations. So when we're talking about reforming systems of oppression, these are the ideas, these are the jurisdictions where the reform must begin. Right? Okay, so for the last 3 sessions, we've been talking about repenting of racism in America. We've been identifying what that repentance might look like as Americans take responsibility for the external and the internal barriers that have been erected in our society that prevent Black thriving in American society. And in July, I'd like to take a step back from these proposals to compare and contrast our biblical approach, which I described in some detail today, our biblical approach to social justice with the dominant secular approaches in our society. And today I've pretty much just focused on the last couple weeks, last couple sessions on a progressive approach. But what I'd like to do is put progressive approach on a wider spectrum of modern secular approaches and deal with each briefly in turn with a critique, okay? And then in August, I'd like to come back and dig in with a closer examination of what we now know as critical race theory, which I'd say on the spectrum of secular approaches to social justice, from a right-wing to a left-wing approach, critical race theory is on the far left side of that spectrum. So, because that is the dominant ideology that has really come roaring into everybody's consciousness in the last 5 years or so, I'd like to spend a session on that by itself. We'll do that in August. So I really appreciate you all's attention, your interest in this, your support and input, and your prayers as I have worked through this material and put these talks together. Thank you guys, and God bless you.